I used to pet sit regularly back in college. It was easy money: feed pets, water some plants, stay overnight, and get paid. Most jobs were simple enough that I could just hang out, catch up on some Netflix, or study in peace. Usually, it was straightforward. Usually. But there was one weekend in particular that made me reconsider ever pet sitting again. It began when a friend recommended me to a couple I'd never met before. They were going out of town for a wedding, and their usual pet sitter was unavailable. They lived just outside town in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. When I first saw their house, I was impressed. A charming, spacious 2-story home, painted a soft blue, with neatly trimmed hedges and flower beds. It looked like something straight out of a real estate magazine. The couple greeted me warmly, introducing me to their dog Molly, a sweet older golden retriever with gentle eyes and a wagging tail. Molly instantly took to me, pressing her head into my palm as I scratched behind her ears. They gave me a brief tour of the house, explaining Molly's routine and handing me a detailed sheet with instructions. At the very bottom, in bold handwriting, one instruction stood out clearly: do not let Molly go into the basement. Keep the basement door locked at all times. The tone seemed unusually serious compared to the rest of their instructions. I figured maybe it was where they kept valuables or stored things that might hurt Molly if she got in. I shrugged it off, promised I'd follow their rules, and waved them goodbye as they drove off. The first day was normal. I fed Molly twice, took her on a long, leisurely walk around the neighborhood, and settled down in front of the TV to binge-watch a series. By evening, Molly was curled up at my feet, contentedly sleeping. The house felt warm and comfortable, peaceful even. But things changed later that night. Around midnight, I woke up abruptly, heart pounding in my chest. At first, I wasn't sure why I'd woken up, but then I heard it. A soft scratching sound, faint but persistent, like fingernails lightly scraping across wood. I lay still, listening. The sound continued. Slowly, I got out of bed, slipping into the hallway. Molly stood at the top of the stairs, her eyes fixed downward, her fur bristling slightly. The scratching was coming from somewhere downstairs. My heartbeat quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Molly," I whispered softly. She glanced at me but didn't move. Reluctantly, I moved down the stairs, flipping on lights as I went, trying to chase away the unease. The scratching led me straight to the basement door. A chill crawled up my spine as I stared at the doorknob. Had I left it unlocked after all? The owner's warning echoed loudly in my mind. I slowly reached for the handle, feeling dread pool in my stomach. It was unlocked, but as soon as my fingers touched the knob, the scratching ceased completely. I stood frozen, heart hammering. The silence was suddenly deafening. I quickly locked the door, backing away and hurrying back upstairs. Molly remained at the top, her eyes wide, watching me closely. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, ears straining for any hint of that terrible scratching sound, but it never returned. When daylight broke, I felt foolish. In the clarity of morning, I convinced myself that it was probably mice or some minor issue. I distracted myself by playing fetch with Molly in the backyard, pretending everything was fine. But as night fell again, my nerves returned. I double-checked every lock, especially the basement door. I even wedged a chair beneath its handle just to ease my anxiety. Molly seemed uneasy too, pacing restlessly. Hours passed. Just as I was drifting into a restless sleep, the scratching returned. This time, it was louder, frantic, desperate, like someone clawing at the wood, trying to get out. My blood ran cold. Molly bolted down the stairs, barking fiercely, hackles fully raised. I'd never heard her bark before. It was deep, protective, and terrifyingly urgent. I stumbled after her, reaching the basement door, as Molly snarled and snapped at the crack beneath it. The scratching intensified, punctuated by occasional thuds, heavy enough to rattle the door itself. Then suddenly silence again. I hesitated, terrified yet compelled to find answers. I slowly leaned toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood. My breathing echoed in my ears. Nothing. Then, a deafening bang from the other side of the door, like a fist slamming violently against it. I jumped back, heart racing, nearly tripping over Molly. Without thinking, I grabbed her collar, pulling her back upstairs. We barricaded ourselves in the guest bedroom, locking the door and dragging furniture in front of it. Molly stayed by my side, whining softly, her eyes wide with fear. We stayed awake, counting the minutes until sunrise. When the owners returned the next morning, I felt sick and exhausted. I described what had happened, expecting shock or concern. Instead, they exchanged strange, knowing glances. The husband calmly smiled, shaking his head dismissively. "Old houses make noises. It's just the wood expanding and contracting," he said, handing me my payment. Their faces said something else entirely. I left quickly, relieved it was over, but deeply unsettled. Days later, curiosity got the better of me. I mentioned the incident to my friend who recommended me. After some hesitation, she finally admitted something deeply unsettling. She'd once asked the couple why the basement was always locked. They had told her bluntly that the house didn't have one. They claimed the basement was sealed off decades ago after something happened down there. Something so terrible that the previous owners had permanently sealed the room and had it removed from the house's blueprints. To this day, I still wonder, if the basement didn't exist, what was behind that door? And worse, what had been trying so desperately to escape? Back in college, I used to pet sit regularly for extra money. It was usually a calm gig, just staying at people's houses while they were away, watching their pets and occasionally watering a few plants. Nothing unusual ever happened. Well, almost nothing. One summer, I got hired by Mr. Morrison, a quiet older gentleman who lived on the edge of town. He traveled frequently, and he'd pay well, making it one of my favorite regular jobs. He had an old sleepy beagle named Sam, who was as calm as could be, honestly, the easiest dog to watch. Sam spent most of his time curled up by the fireplace or sleeping near my feet while I studied. Mr. Morrison's home was old but charming, a 2-story brick house tucked at the end of a quiet street lined with oak trees. It felt welcoming at first, with warm lighting, antique furniture, and shelves full of vintage books. But something about the place always felt a little off. Maybe it was just the old wooden floors that creaked underfoot, or how the room seemed just a little too still when you were alone. Still, I ignored any odd feelings, dismissing them as my imagination. Then came the night that changed everything. It started around midnight. I was asleep in the guest room upstairs when suddenly a sharp barking jolted me awake. I sat up, confused and groggy, trying to process the noise. It was Sam, but I'd never heard him bark before, not even once. He was always so quiet and timid, especially at night. He wasn't stopping. Uneasy, I climbed out of bed and moved quietly toward the hallway, the wooden floor cold beneath my feet. My heart beat a little faster with each step, the barking getting louder, more frantic. I peered cautiously out of the bedroom door into the shadowy hallway. Sam stood in front of the stairs, fur bristled, growling deeply. His gaze was fixed at the end of the corridor. I followed his eyes, squinting into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just shadows shifting with the movement of the old house settling. Then my eyes caught something faint, a glint in the dark, 2 tiny points of reflected light. Eyes. My heartbeat quickened as I took a careful step forward. Was there an animal in the house? Mr. Morrison had never mentioned owning any pets besides Sam. I softly called out, my voice barely above a whisper, expecting to see a stray cat dart away. Instead, the eyes remained still, unmoving, just staring at me. A chill crawled slowly up my spine. I took another step closer, and the eyes suddenly vanished, followed by the soft patter of footsteps retreating down the stairs. Heart pounding, I ran forward, flicking on every light I could reach. Sam reluctantly followed, whining quietly, clearly disturbed. I spent the next hour combing through every room downstairs, turning lights on as I went. The house was empty, no windows open, no doors unlocked, and absolutely no sign of any cat or anything else. Eventually, convinced I'd imagined it, I forced myself to go back to bed, though sleep was impossible after that. The next day passed uneventfully, and I began to convince myself the incident was just a strange dream. But that false comfort wouldn't last. That evening, just past midnight again, Sam woke me once more with barking, only this time it was louder, frantic, terrified. My heart raced as I leapt out of bed, the hairs on my neck standing on end. As soon as I stepped into the hall, my pulse quickened even further. The eyes were back. This time, they were closer, low to the ground, reflecting in the shadows just outside the open bedroom door. Panic surged through me. Without thinking, I lunged for the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. The eyes vanished instantly, but something else caught my attention. The bedroom door creaked slowly, deliberately open, revealing an empty hallway. I felt a wave of dread settle in my stomach. Sam had gone silent, now pressed against my legs, trembling. Whatever was happening, he felt it too. When Mr. Morrison returned the following evening, I was relieved to see him. Gathering my courage, I finally asked if he had ever noticed a cat in the house, maybe a neighbor's pet or a stray. His face went pale instantly. His demeanor shifted completely, from friendly to visibly disturbed. He sat down slowly, taking off his glasses and rubbing his eyes like he'd been hoping no one would ever ask about it. Reluctantly, he explained that the house had belonged to someone else before him, an elderly woman who adored cats. The neighborhood loved her, and she was known for rescuing strays. But one night, a sudden, terrible fire engulfed the lower floor. She survived, but her beloved cats didn't, all except one, a cat the fire department never found. Even after renovations, neighbors swore they'd occasionally see a small animal staring out from the windows, but no one ever caught it or confirmed its existence. Mr. Morrison had ignored the stories, thinking it just local folklore. But after hearing my experience, he wasn't sure anymore. Neither was I. I didn't pet sit there again. But after that night, sometimes I'd wake in my own bed at home, startled by a faint scratching sound, or the imagined feeling of eyes watching me from the shadows. And each time I'd lie awake, too afraid to check, because deep down, I wondered if I'd ever truly left Mr. Morrison's house behind, or if something unseen had quietly followed me home. I'd done plenty of pet-sitting jobs before, cats, dogs, even birds and fish. It was usually an easy way to earn some extra cash, especially since it meant spending quiet evenings studying or relaxing while looking after people's pets. But nothing could have prepared me for the night I stayed at Miranda's cabin. Miranda lived on the very outskirts of town, far enough away to feel isolated, but close enough that the commute didn't feel impossible. Her house was more like a rustic cabin, small, cozy, but somewhat unnerving in its solitude, surrounded by dense trees and an oppressive silence. She traveled frequently, and I was hired through an ad. Her only pet was Rufus, a large jet-black dog with fur thick enough to resemble a wolf's, and eyes that were unsettlingly intelligent. When I arrived, Miranda greeted me briefly, clearly anxious to leave. She handed me a piece of paper with detailed instructions for caring for Rufus. Everything seemed standard: feeding amounts, walk-in schedule, except for one very specific line, written in bold, underlined twice. Feed Rufus at exactly midnight, never earlier, never later. It seemed odd, but pet owners often had their quirks. Perhaps Rufus needed precise medication, or had dietary issues. I shrugged it off and reassured her I'd be careful. The first evening, everything went smoothly. I watched the clock carefully, poured his food at exactly midnight, and Rufus ate quietly before disappearing out the doggy door into the darkness. He moved silently, almost ghost-like. It unnerved me slightly, but I brushed it off. Dogs often roamed at night, especially out here. The second night, however, I made a mistake. After a long, tedious day of studying, I fell asleep on the couch while watching TV. When I woke up suddenly, the clock read 12:07. A surge of panic filled me. The instructions flashed vividly through my mind. Exactly midnight, they'd said. Rufus was already standing silently by his bowl, watching me with those deep, penetrating eyes. Heart pounding, I quickly filled his bowl, whispering a half-hearted apology, hoping it wouldn't matter. But Rufus didn't eat. He sniffed the bowl once, then looked at me, his eyes calm, but somehow too knowing. He turned away and padded slowly to the doggy door, slipping quietly outside into the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat on the couch, heart racing, wondering why such a small mistake felt so dreadful. I told myself it was nothing, just a picky dog. Then I heard it, a distant howl, low, mournful, coming from deep within the woods. A second howl answered, then another, echoing closer and closer. My blood went cold. Wolves. But they never came this close to town, did they? The howling grew louder, more aggressive, circling the cabin. Rufus's howl suddenly joined them, low, mournful, almost human in its sadness. I shivered, gripping the couch tightly. The cabin felt small and fragile, isolated in the suffocating darkness. Then, the scratching began. At first, it was subtle, barely audible, like claws gently scraping along the walls outside. It quickly became frantic, more desperate, as if multiple creatures were trying to claw their way in. The windows began rattling, then the front door shook violently, as though something large was trying to force its way inside. I jumped from the couch, grabbing a poker from the fireplace, breathing heavily, waiting for whatever nightmare waited just beyond that thin wooden door. Suddenly, silence returned, as abruptly as it had vanished. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, waiting for another sound, another sign. But nothing came. Slowly, I crept toward the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. Outside was utterly still. No wolves, no Rufus. Nothing, just the dark, shadowy trees stretching endlessly into the night. Unease clawed at my stomach. Sleep was impossible after that. When the morning finally broke, bright sunlight filled the cabin as though nothing had happened. Rufus sat quietly by the door, tail gently wagging as I stared at him with disbelief. Outside, there were no paw prints, no signs of disturbance. The dirt driveway was untouched, the grass unmarked. The rest of the weekend passed slowly. I followed Miranda's instructions obsessively, counting each second until midnight, terrified of repeating my mistake. Rufus remained silent, obedient, oddly watchful, as though he knew I was now aware of his secret, or at least some part of it. When Miranda returned, she greeted me politely but seemed anxious. I mentioned briefly about the noises and asked if wolves were common around here. Her smile faded instantly, replaced by a guarded look. She paid me quickly, thanked me for my time, and mentioned she'd found someone else for future trips. I never heard from her again. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove out toward the cabin, but as I reached the dirt road leading into the woods, I stopped abruptly. A chain blocked the driveway, a weathered sign reading, "Private property. No trespassing." Beyond it, the path leading toward the cabin was overgrown, almost hidden, as though no one had lived there in years. Confused and unnerved, I asked around town. People looked uncomfortable, changing the subject quickly. One older local finally mentioned something about a woman who used to live out there years ago, who'd kept strange pets. Rumors said she'd left abruptly one night after something happened, abandoning the property entirely. I felt my blood run cold. If the woman I'd pet sat for wasn't Miranda, who was she? And what had I actually been feeding every night at exactly midnight? Ever since then, on clear, quiet nights, I still hear distant howling, always at midnight, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I'd been just a few minutes later again.